On the night of my 25th anniversary gala, I woke up with patches of hair missing. The maid, who was secretly sleeping with my husband, had mixed chemicals in my shampoo. Oops! Nobody wants a bald wife. He is mine now. So, I decided to play along. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I woke up that Saturday morning the same way I had for 25 years, reaching across the Egyptian cotton sheets to find Carlton's side of the bed already cold. The grandfather clock in our Beacon Hill bedroom chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the master suite that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now seemed more like a beautiful prison. Today was supposed to be different. Today was our 25th wedding anniversary, and tonight would be the gala I had spent months planning. 500 guests, the city's elite, all gathered to celebrate what everyone believed was a perfect marriage. I stretched, feeling the familiar ache in my 64-year-old joints, and ran my fingers through my hair, or tried to. My hand came away with clumps of chestnut strands, far more than the usual morning loss. Confused, I sat up and looked at my pillow. Horror washed over me like ice water. My pillowcase was covered in hair. Not just a few strands, but thick patches that looked like someone had taken scissors, or worse, to my head while I slept. I stumbled to the bathroom mirror, my bare feet cold against the marble floor, and gasped at my reflection. Irregular bald patches dotted my scalp like a cruel map of destruction. Some areas were completely bare, showing pale skin that had never seen sunlight. Other sections had hair so damaged it broke off at the touch. 25 years of carefully maintained chestnut waves, the hair Carlton once claimed to love, was gone. "Bryn!" I called out, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "Bryn, I need help!" Footsteps approached quickly down the hallway. Bryn appeared in the doorway, her 29-year-old face a picture of manufactured concern. She had worked for us for 10 years, ever since she was 19 and desperate for a job. I had taken her in like a daughter, taught her everything about running our household, trusted her with our most intimate details. "Oh my goodness, Mrs. Whitmore," she gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "What happened to your hair?" "I don't know," I whispered, touching another damaged section. "I just woke up like this. Could it be my shampoo? Did you notice anything different about it?" Bryn stepped closer, her green eyes scanning the bathroom counter where my luxury hair products sat in their usual neat arrangement. For just a moment, I caught something in her expression. Not shock, but satisfaction. It flickered so quickly I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. "Well," she said slowly, picking up the bottle of shampoo I had used the night before, "this does look a little different. The color seems off." I grabbed the bottle from her hands. The familiar amber liquid inside now had a strange greenish tint, and when I unscrewed the cap, the scent was wrong. Instead of the usual botanical fragrance, there was a harsh chemical smell that made my eyes water. "Someone tampered with this," I said, the words feeling surreal as they left my lips. "Someone put chemicals in my shampoo." Bryn's face transformed then, the mask of concern sliding away to reveal something cold and calculating. She leaned against the marble counter, crossing her arms, and smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Oops," she said, her voice light and mocking. "Nobody wants a bald wife, especially not at 64. He's mine now, Roberta." The casual cruelty of her words hit me harder than the physical destruction of my hair. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even a crime of passion. This was calculated, deliberate, and designed to humiliate me on the most important day of our marriage celebration. "You did this," I said, not a question but a statement. "You destroyed my hair." "I did," she confirmed with a shrug. "Carlton deserves better than a dried-up old woman clinging to her past beauty. He deserves someone young, someone who can give him what you never could." My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the marble vanity for support. "What are you talking about? Carlton and you are finished," Bryn interrupted. Have been for years, really. You just never noticed because you were too busy playing the perfect society wife, planning your little parties and charity luncheons while ignoring what your husband actually needed. She moved closer, and I could smell her perfume. My perfume, the expensive French fragrance Carlton had given me for Christmas. Seeing her wear it felt like another violation, another theft of my identity. How long? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. 2 years, she said proudly. 2 wonderful years of actually being appreciated, of being loved by a man who knows quality when he sees it. 2 years. While I had been planning dinner parties and managing household staff and believing that my marriage was simply going through a quiet phase, my husband had been sleeping with the woman I trusted to run my home. The woman I had helped, mentored, treated like family. The gala is tonight, I said weakly. 500 people are expecting— Oh, the gala will go on, Bryn assured me. Carlton wouldn't want to disappoint his business associates, but you won't be attending, not looking like that. Maybe you can help serve drinks in the kitchen instead, if we can find you a hat to cover that mess. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. By the way, you might want to start looking at apartments, small ones. Carlton's lawyer will be calling soon. The sound of her heels clicking down the hardwood hallway faded, leaving me alone with my destroyed reflection and the overwhelming scent of chemical damage. I sank onto the marble bench beside the vanity, my hands shaking as the full scope of their betrayal began to register. They had planned this. Not just the affair, but this specific humiliation. They wanted me to look pathetic at my own anniversary celebration, to appear so damaged and pitiful that no one would question Carlton's eventual decision to leave me. They were counting on my vanity, my pride, my desperate need to maintain appearances. I picked up my phone to call my hairstylist, then remembered it was 7 in the morning on a Saturday. Even if I could reach someone, what could they do? The damage was too extensive, too deliberate. No amount of styling could hide the bare patches or repair the chemical burns on my scalp. For 25 years, I had played by their rules. I had been the dutiful wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who never made waves or asked uncomfortable questions. I had trusted, supported, and sacrificed for people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their happiness. But as I sat there in my marble bathroom, surrounded by the expensive trappings of a life built on lies, something new began to grow inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, more calculating. Something that felt remarkably like the patience of a predator who had finally identified her prey. I stood up slowly, studying my damaged reflection one more time. Then I reached for my phone and began making calls. Not to hairstylists or makeup artists or anyone who might help me look presentable for tonight's gala. I called my lawyer. After all, if Carlton and Bryn thought they could destroy me with chemicals and cruelty, they had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I had spent 25 years learning to be the perfect wife. Now it was time to learn how to be the perfect enemy. 3 hours after my devastating discovery, I sat in the leather chair across from my attorney's mahogany desk, a silk scarf wrapped carefully around my damaged hair. Margaret Chen had been handling my family's legal affairs for 15 years, and her expression grew more grim with each detail I shared. "Chemical hair destruction, you said?" she asked, making notes in her precise handwriting. "That could constitute assault, Roberta. Have you considered filing criminal charges?" "Not yet," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I need to understand the full scope of what they're planning first." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the sharp intelligence that had made her one of Boston's most respected family attorneys. "You're not acting like someone who just discovered her husband's infidelity. Most clients come in here emotional, demanding immediate action." I touched the silk scarf self-consciously. 25 years of marriage teaches you that emotional reactions rarely produce the best outcomes. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to quietly review all our financial arrangements, joint accounts, Properties, investments, insurance policies, everything. I suspect Carlton has been making changes I'm unaware of. Margaret nodded, already reaching for her phone to call her investigative team. What about the anniversary gala tonight? Will you attend? I stood up, smoothing down my navy dress. Of course I will. Carlton and Bryn are expecting me to hide in shame, to cancel the event or make excuses. Instead, I'm going to play the role they least expect. Which is, for the first time that day, I smiled genuinely. The perfect, oblivious wife. The drive back to Beacon Hill gave me time to think. Carlton's Lexus was gone from our circular driveway, which meant he was probably at his office, making final arrangements for tonight's event. Or perhaps he was somewhere else entirely, celebrating his successful humiliation of the woman who had stood by him for 25 years. I found Bryn in the kitchen, arranging white orchids with the easy confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She looked up when I entered, clearly expecting to see a broken, defeated woman. Instead, I had stopped at a boutique wig shop and purchased a chestnut piece that, while not perfect, was close enough to my natural color to fool casual observers. "Oh," she said, disappointment flickering across her face. "You fixed your hair problem." "Just a temporary solution," I said lightly, moving to the coffee machine. I called my stylist. She's coming by at 3 to assess the damage and create something appropriate for tonight's gala. It was a lie, of course, but Bryn didn't need to know that. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," I continued, measuring coffee grounds with steady hands. "About Carlton needing something different. You're probably right." Bryn set down her orchid arrangement, clearly surprised by my calm response. "I am?" Of course. Marriage is work, and perhaps I've been too focused on appearances, on maintaining our social obligations, to notice what Carlton actually needed. I turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. "How long did you say this has been going on?" 2 years, she repeated, watching me carefully. 2 years, I mused. And I never suspected. I suppose that says something about how disconnected we've become. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Bryn had prepared for tears, rage, desperate attempts to save my marriage. She hadn't prepared for rational conversation about her betrayal. "You're taking this surprisingly well," she said suspiciously. "What choice do I have?" I asked, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "If Carlton is happier with you, then perhaps it's time for me to accept that and figure out my next steps." I offered her a cup. "Would you like some coffee? We should probably discuss the practical arrangements." Bryn accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. "What kind of practical arrangements?" "Well, if Carlton is planning to leave me, I'll need to know so I can prepare financially. Find a smaller place to live, perhaps. Adjust my lifestyle expectations." I took a sip of my coffee, watching her face over the rim. "I assume he'll want to handle this quietly, avoid any messy legal battles that might damage his business reputation." We haven't discussed the details yet," Bryn stammered. "Of course not. These things take time to plan properly." I sat down at the kitchen island, gesturing for her to join me. "Tell me about your relationship with Carlton. I'm curious what he found in you that he felt was missing in our marriage." For the next hour, Bryn talked, and I listened, filing away every detail, every casual revelation, every piece of information she unknowingly provided about their affair and their future plans. Carlton wanted to wait until after the gala to begin divorce proceedings. They had already looked at condominiums in the Back Bay. Bryn had been using my credit cards to purchase clothes for their weekend trips to the Cape. Carlton had been telling her intimate details about our financial situation, our marriage problems, even my private medical appointments. "He says you're impossible to live with," Bryn confided, apparently believing we were now allies in some twisted way. Always concerned with what other people think, never spontaneous, never really present in the moment. That does sound frustrating for him, I agreed. A man needs a woman who can match his energy, his passion for life. Exactly. Bryn's eyes brightened. Carlton is so vital, so full of life. He deserves someone who appreciates that. And you clearly do. I do. I love everything about him, his ambition, his intelligence, even his moods. He's never boring, never predictable. I nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you two are very compatible. I'm glad he found that kind of connection. By the time Carlton returned home at 4 o'clock, Bryn and I appeared to be the best of friends, planning the evening's final details together. He paused in the kitchen doorway, clearly confused by the domestic harmony he found. "How are the preparations going?" he asked carefully, his gray eyes moving between us. "Wonderfully," I said, rising to kiss his cheek as I had done thousands of times before. "Bryn has been invaluable today. I don't know what I'd do without her." Carlton relaxed slightly, apparently relieved that I wasn't creating the emotional scene he had probably expected. "Good. The caterers should arrive at 5 and the musicians at 6. Everything is ready," I assured him. "I just need to get dressed. Will you be wearing your navy suit or the charcoal?" "Navy," he said, already heading toward his study. "I have a few calls to make before guests arrive." I watched him go, noting how he avoided eye contact, how his shoulders carried the tension of a man with secrets. Then I turned to Bryn, who was observing this interaction with fascination. "He seems nervous," she commented. "Anniversary parties can be stressful," I replied. "So much pressure to make everything perfect." What I didn't tell her was that I had spent the morning learning far more than she realized during our friendly conversation. I now knew they had been planning this betrayal for months, that Carlton had already consulted with a divorce attorney, and that they had severely underestimated both my intelligence and my capacity for strategic thinking. I excused myself to get ready for the evening, climbing the curved staircase to our master bedroom with measured steps. In my dressing room, I selected a midnight blue gown that had always been one of Carlton's favorites, then sat at my vanity to apply makeup with the precision of an actress preparing for the performance of her lifetime. The woman staring back at me from the mirror looked elegant, composed, completely unaware that her marriage was about to implode. It was exactly the illusion I needed to maintain. Tonight, Carlton and Bryn would celebrate what they believed was their victory. They would watch me play the gracious hostess while secretly knowing they had destroyed me that morning. They would smile and accept congratulations on our 25-year marriage while planning its demise. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed that a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of social grace would crumble when faced with betrayal. Instead, I had simply learned a new role to play. I adjusted my wig one final time, checked my lipstick, and prepared to give the performance of my life. After all, the best revenge often begins with letting your enemies believe they've already won. The anniversary gala was everything I had planned it to be. Elegant, sophisticated, and flawlessly executed. 500 guests filled the ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in ivory silk. Carlton moved through the crowd like the successful businessman he appeared to be, accepting congratulations on our 25 years of marriage with the easy charm that had first attracted me to him decades ago. I played my part perfectly. The gracious hostess in midnight blue, my carefully styled wig drawing compliments from friends who had no idea what had happened that morning. When people asked about my new hairstyle, I simply smiled and mentioned trying something different for our special night. Bryn worked the event as she always did, coordinating with the catering staff and ensuring every detail ran smoothly. But I caught her watching Carlton throughout the evening, her green eyes following his every movement with possessive intensity. When their gazes met across the crowded room, the brief exchange of looks confirmed everything she had told me that morning. "Roberta, you look absolutely radiant tonight," said Victoria Whitmore, Carlton's sister, as she approached with a glass of champagne. Victoria had never particularly warmed to me during our marriage, but she maintained the polite facade that our social circle demanded. "Thank you, Victoria. I'm so glad you could be here," She studied my face with the sharp intelligence that ran in the Whitmore family. "You seem different tonight, more serene. Marriage certainly agrees with you after all these years." If only she knew how different everything really was. "I've learned that happiness comes from accepting what life gives you rather than fighting against it." Victoria raised an eyebrow at this philosophical response, but was interrupted by Carlton's approach. He placed his hand on the small of my back with practiced affection, the gesture so automatic, I doubt he even thought about it. "Ladies, are you enjoying the evening?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight strain I had learned to recognize over 25 years. Carlton always got tense at large social gatherings, though he hid it well. "It's a beautiful party, Carlton," Victoria replied. "You two certainly know how to celebrate properly." "Roberta planned everything," he said, and for a moment his smile seemed genuine. "She has exquisite taste." The irony wasn't lost on me. Carlton was praising my taste on the same day his mistress had chemically destroyed my hair. I wondered if he even knew what Bryn had done, or if she had acted independently, driven by her own jealousy and cruelty. "If you'll excuse me," I said graciously, "I should check on the dessert service." I made my way through the crowd, accepting compliments and air kisses from Boston's social elite, until I reached the quiet corridor outside the ballroom. Margaret Chen was waiting for me there, her expression grave. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "What I found today changes everything." We slipped into a small conference room the hotel had provided for private conversations. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Your instincts were correct about Carlton making financial changes," she began. "But the scope is far worse than you imagined." She spread papers across the polished table, bank statements, property deeds, insurance documents. My chest tightened as I recognized account numbers and signatures, but also saw names and amounts I had never seen before. "Carlton has been systematically moving assets into offshore accounts for the past 18 months, Margaret explained. "The Cayman Islands account alone contains $800,000. $800,000, money that should have been in our joint investments, our retirement planning, our shared future that apparently no longer existed." "There's more," Margaret continued. "He's been taking out loans against your joint properties without your knowledge, using forged documents with your signature. The house in Beacon Hill now has a $700,000 lien against it." I sank into one of the leather chairs, the weight of Carlton's betrayal settling over me like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't even just the cruelty of destroying my hair on our anniversary. This was systematic financial abuse, carefully planned over months or even years. How is this legal? How could banks accept my signature without my presence? "They shouldn't have," Margaret said grimly. "But Carlton has relationships with these institutions going back decades. They trusted him, and he exploited that trust." She pulled out another document, this one official-looking with a government seal. "But this is the most shocking discovery. I ran a background check on Bryn Morrison, as you requested. I looked at the document, not understanding at first what I was seeing. Birth certificate, family records, employment history. Then one line jumped out at me, and I felt the room spin slightly. Father, Charles Whitmore. Charles Whitmore, Carlton's father who had died 5 years ago. Bryn is Carlton's half-sister, Margaret said quietly. Charles had an affair with her mother in 1994, but never acknowledged paternity. Bryn's mother died when she was 17, and she's been on her own ever since. My mind raced through the implications. Bryn hadn't just stumbled into our lives as a young woman needing work. She had sought us out deliberately, knowing exactly who we were, what we represented, what she felt she was owed. Does Carlton know? I whispered. I believe he does. Look at this. Margaret showed me another document, a DNA test dated 6 months ago, confirming the biological relationship between Carlton and Bryn Morrison. 6 months ago. right around the time their affair had escalated from casual flirtation to full sexual relationship. The timing couldn't be coincidental. "They're not just lovers," I said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "They're partners in stealing everything Charles Whitmore left behind. Everything that should have been shared with his legitimate family. It appears so. The offshore accounts, the property loans, even some of the business contracts Carlton has signed recently, they're all structured to benefit both of them while leaving you with nothing." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the Boston Common where couples strolled under streetlights, believing in the permanence of love and trust. How naive they seemed from this height. How innocent in their faith that the people closest to them would never deliberately destroy them. "There's one more thing," Margaret said softly. "Bryn is pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned from the window, searching Margaret's face for some sign that she was mistaken. "How do you know?" "Medical records from her doctor's appointment last week. She's 8 weeks along." 8 weeks. Which meant the baby had been conceived right around the time Carlton began the most aggressive phase of moving our assets offshore. They hadn't just been planning an affair, they had been planning a complete family replacement. Carlton would divorce me, marry his half-sister, and raise their child using money stolen from our 25-year marriage. The genetic implications made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to focus on the immediate legal realities. What are our options? We file immediately for separation of assets and freeze all joint accounts. We petition the court to reverse the unauthorized loans and recover the offshore funds. And we gather evidence of the systematic fraud for both civil and criminal proceedings. I nodded, surprised by how calm I felt despite the magnitude of what I had learned. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was the relief of finally understanding the full scope of what I was fighting against. "How long do we have before they realize we know?" "Not long. Once we start the legal process, Carlton will be notified within 48 hours. Through the conference room's window, I could see the ballroom where our anniversary celebration continued. Carlton was probably making his toast right now, thanking everyone for sharing this special milestone with us. Bryn would be standing at the back of the room, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, watching the man she thought she had successfully seduced away from his boring old wife. They had no idea that their carefully constructed plan was about to implode. "Begin the filings first thing Monday morning," I told Margaret. "Everything you mentioned, asset protection, loan reversal, fraud charges, all of it." "What about tonight? Will you confront them?" I gathered my composure, straightening my shoulders and checking my reflection in the conference room's mirror. The elegant woman looking back at me showed no trace of the devastating knowledge I now carried. "No," I said firmly. "Tonight, I'm going to go back to my anniversary party and continue being the perfect wife. I'm going to smile and dance with my husband and thank our guests for celebrating our 25 years of marriage." Margaret looked puzzled. "Why?" "Because the best part of any game is watching your opponents celebrate their victory right before they realize they've lost." I returned to the ballroom just as Carlton was finishing his toast. He raised his champagne flute toward me, his face glowing with what anyone else would interpret as marital devotion. "To my beautiful wife, Roberta," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "who has made these 25 years the foundation of everything good in my life." The guests erupted in applause. I smiled graciously and raised my own glass, meeting Carlton's eyes across the crowded room. "To foundations," I said quietly, knowing only I could appreciate the irony. After all, foundations could be built up, but they could also be completely destroyed. The Monday morning after our anniversary gala arrived gray and drizzling, perfectly matching my mood as I sat in our sunroom watching Carlton prepare for what he believed was just another ordinary day. He hummed while reading the Financial Times, occasionally glancing up to smile at me over his coffee cup. The picture of a contented husband who had successfully celebrated 25 years of marriage. If only he knew that I had spent the weekend documenting every piece of evidence Margaret Chen would need for the legal filings that were about to destroy his carefully constructed deception. "Beautiful party Saturday night," he said, folding his newspaper with characteristic precision. "You outdid yourself, darling." "Thank you. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves." I kept my voice light, conversational. "Victoria mentioned how relaxed you looked. She said she hasn't seen you that happy in years." Carlton's smile flickered slightly. "Did she? Well, anniversary celebrations do tend to put things in perspective." Indeed they did. Mine had certainly clarified exactly what kind of man I had been married to for 25 years. "I was thinking we should take a vacation," I continued, buttering my toast with deliberate casualness. "Maybe that trip to Tuscany we've been discussing. Now that the gala is behind us, we could finally have some time to reconnect." The irony of suggesting a romantic getaway to a man who was systematically stealing from me while sleeping with his half-sister wasn't lost on me. But I needed to maintain the illusion that I remained blissfully unaware of their betrayal. Carlton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That sounds wonderful, but I have some complicated business deals closing over the next few weeks. Perhaps we could plan something for later in the summer." "Of course, business first." I smiled understandingly. "Will you be working late again tonight?" "Probably. These international contracts require conference calls at odd hours." International contracts. More like international banking, moving our stolen assets beyond the reach of American courts. But I simply nodded and poured myself more coffee from the silver service that had been a wedding gift from his parents 25 years ago. "I'll have Bryn keep dinner warm for you." At the mention of Bryn's name, Carlton's entire posture changed. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing deepened, and for just a moment his professional mask slipped to reveal something almost tender. It was the way he used to look when thinking about me, back when our marriage was real. "Actually," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I've been meaning to discuss Bryn with you." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression mildly curious. "Oh?" "I think we should give her more responsibilities around the house. She's been with us for 10 years now, and she's proven herself invaluable. Perhaps we could increase her salary, give her more autonomy over household decisions." More autonomy, more access to our accounts, our schedules, our private information, more opportunities to facilitate their theft and deception. "That's very generous of you," I said. "What kind of increase were you thinking?" "I thought we might double her current salary, from $1,200 to $2,400 per month. $2,400, enough to help fund the new life they were planning together, while I remained ignorant of their conspiracy." The casual way he suggested such a significant expense, without any discussion of our budget or financial priorities, revealed just how little he respected me or our supposed partnership. "That seems reasonable," I agreed. "Should I handle the paperwork, or would you prefer to take care of it?" "I'll take care of it," Carlton said quickly. Too quickly. "I know how busy you are with your charity commitments." My charity commitments. The volunteer work that kept me occupied and out of his way while he dismantled our marriage piece by piece. How thoughtful of him to ensure I had plenty of distractions. "Speaking of which," I said, "I promised Margaret Chen I'd stop by her office this afternoon to discuss the foundation's legal structure. Apparently there are some tax advantages we haven't been utilizing." Carlton's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "Margaret Chen? Why are you meeting with our lawyer?" "Oh, she's not just our lawyer anymore. The foundation hired her to handle their corporate governance issues." I kept my tone light, almost bored. Boring stuff, really, but necessary for maintaining our nonprofit status. This was a carefully constructed lie. Margaret was indeed meeting with me that afternoon, but to begin the legal assault that would protect what remained of our assets and expose Carlton's systematic fraud. However, Carlton didn't need to know that. "I see," he said, clearly relieved that my lawyer meeting had nothing to do with our marriage. "Well, Don't let her talk you into anything too complicated. These legal types love to overcomplicate simple situations. After Carlton left for his office, I waited exactly 30 minutes before retrieving the small digital recorder I had hidden in the dining room sideboard. Modern technology was a wonderful thing. Devices no larger than a thumb drive could capture hours of conversation with perfect clarity. I had been recording every interaction with Carlton and Bryn since Saturday night, building a comprehensive audio diary of their deception. Carlton's offer to double Bryn's salary, his reluctance to take a vacation, his obvious discomfort when I mentioned meeting with Margaret, all of it was now preserved as evidence. Bryn arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, as she had every weekday for the past 10 years. But this morning I saw her differently, knowing what Margaret had revealed about her true identity and her pregnancy. The way she moved through our house with increasing confidence, touching objects that didn't belong to her, planning a future in spaces I had decorated and cherished. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," she said with the false brightness I now recognized as pure performance. "How was your weekend after the party?" Quiet and peaceful, exactly what I needed after all that excitement. I paused to study her face, looking for any sign of her pregnancy. "You look well, Bryn," positively glowing. A slight flush crept up her neck. "Thank you. I've been feeling very energetic lately." Energetic. Probably from the rush of believing she had successfully destroyed my marriage and stolen my husband. Little did she know that her victory celebration was premature. "I'm so glad. Carlton mentioned this morning that he'd like to increase your responsibilities around here, along with a substantial raise. You've certainly earned it." Bryn's eyes widened with surprise and something else, triumph. She probably thought Carlton's generosity was proof of his growing commitment to their relationship. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "I do love working here. I can tell. You've made yourself quite at home." I smiled warmly, as if I found her presumption endearing rather than infuriating. "In fact, I've been thinking we should update your living arrangements as well." Bryn lived in a small apartment above our detached garage, a space that had originally been designed for a live-in caretaker. It was comfortable but modest, appropriate for household staff rather than family members. "Update them how?" she asked, clearly intrigued. "Well, if you're going to be taking on more responsibilities, you'll need more space, more privacy. Perhaps it's time to consider finding you a proper apartment somewhere nearby." This was a test. If Bryn was planning to leave with Carlton anyway, she would be eager to discuss alternative living arrangements. If she was committed to maintaining her current deception, she would insist on staying close to monitor my activities. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose any additional expenses," she said quickly. "I'm perfectly comfortable in the garage apartment." Interesting. She wanted to stay close, which suggested their timeline for executing their plan was still months away rather than weeks. They needed more time to complete their financial preparations, to ensure they could disappear with maximum assets and minimum legal exposure. Nonsense. Carlton and I have discussed it, and we both feel you deserve better accommodations. Another lie, but a useful one. In fact, I thought you might like to look at some places this afternoon while I'm at my meeting with Margaret. Bryn's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, suspicion, and finally forced gratitude. "That's incredibly thoughtful, but I really don't need—" "I insist," I interrupted gently. "Consider it a bonus for all your years of dedicated service." What I was really doing was getting her out of the house for several hours so I could conduct a thorough search of her living space. Margaret had given me a list of documents to look for: bank statements, correspondence, anything that might provide additional evidence of the conspiracy against me. After Bryn reluctantly agreed to spend the afternoon apartment hunting, I called Margaret to confirm our afternoon meeting. But first I had work to do. The garage apartment was accessed by an external staircase, giving Bryn complete privacy from the main house. I had rarely visited the space over the years, trusting her to maintain it appropriately. Now I climbed those stairs with a very different purpose. What I found inside shocked me more than I had expected. The modest apartment I remembered had been transformed into something resembling a shrine to Carlton. Photographs of him covered every surface, some taken at family gatherings, others candid shots taken without his knowledge. Magazine articles featuring his business successes were framed on the walls. Even more disturbing was a collection of my personal items that had gone missing over the years. Jewelry, scarves, perfume bottles, displayed on her dresser like trophies. But the most damaging evidence was hidden in a shoebox under her bed. Bank statements showing regular deposits from Carlton's personal account. Copies of legal documents related to the offshore banking arrangements. And most shocking of all, a handwritten timeline detailing their plan to systematically drain our joint assets before filing for divorce. According to Bryn's notes, they had originally planned to wait until our anniversary had passed to avoid any suspicious timing. The baby had accelerated their schedule, but they still intended to complete several more asset transfers before making their move. I photographed everything with my phone, careful to return each item to its exact original position. Then I made one additional discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about their relationship. A love letter from Carlton, dated just 3 days ago, expressing his eagerness to finally be free to love you openly and his excitement about the child we've created together. But the most revealing line was his confession that, "Knowing you're my father's daughter makes this even more meaningful. We're not just lovers, we're family reclaiming what should have been ours from the beginning." They knew. They both knew they were half-siblings, and far from being disturbed by the genetic relationship, they saw it as justification for their theft and betrayal. In their twisted logic, Bryn's illegitimate connection to Charles Whitmore gave them the right to steal everything I had helped Carlton build during our marriage. I sat in Bryn's violated living space, surrounded by evidence of 25 years of deception, and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Pure, crystalline rage. Not the hot anger that makes people act impulsively, but the cold fury that makes them act decisively. By the time I met Margaret that afternoon, I had enough evidence to destroy them both completely. The question was no longer whether I could protect myself. It was how thoroughly I wanted to devastate the people who had betrayed me so completely. As it turned out, the answer was very thoroughly indeed. 3 weeks had passed since I discovered the full scope of Carlton and Bryn's betrayal, and I had spent every day of that time preparing for this moment. Tonight was the annual Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, an event I had organized for 15 consecutive years, raising millions for children's literacy programs across New England. It was also going to be the stage for the most important performance of my life. The ballroom at the Four Seasons sparkled with understated elegance. 800 guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. The cream of Boston society gathered to support a worthy cause while enjoying an evening of fine wine and strategic networking. Carlton moved through the crowd with his usual confidence, accepting praise for our foundation's work as if he had been personally teaching children to read rather than systematically stealing from the organization's benefactors. I watched him from across the room, noting how he kept glancing toward the service entrance where Bryn was coordinating with the catering staff. She looked radiant in a black cocktail dress that cleverly concealed her growing pregnancy, now 12 weeks along according to the medical records Margaret had obtained. Her hand would occasionally drift to her still flat stomach in an unconsciously protective gesture that made my chest tighten with rage. They thought they were so clever, carrying on their affair in plain sight while I remained the oblivious wife. What they didn't know was that I had been recording their every conversation, documenting their every move, and preparing a trap so comprehensive that escape would be impossible. "Roberta, you look absolutely stunning tonight," said Patricia Ashworth, the wife of Boston's most prominent federal judge. "That sapphire necklace is extraordinary." I touched the vintage Van Cleef & Arpels piece that had belonged to Carlton's mother. "Thank you. It seemed appropriate for such a special evening." What I didn't mention was that I had spent the afternoon having the necklace appraised and photographed for insurance purposes. By tomorrow morning, it would be safely locked in a safety deposit box that Carlton couldn't access, along with every other piece of valuable jewelry he might try to claim in divorce proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced from the podium, "please take your seats. We're about to begin this evening's program." I made my way to the head table, where Carlton was already seated beside Victoria, his sister, and her husband James. Victoria had been surprisingly supportive over the past few weeks, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening even if she didn't know the details. "You seem different lately," she had told me during a lunch meeting the previous week. "More focused. It suits you." If only she knew what I was focusing on. As the salad course was served, Carlton leaned close to whisper in my ear, "Everything looks perfect, as always. You've outdone yourself." His breath against my neck might have been intimate once. Now it felt like a violation, made worse by the knowledge that he had whispered similar words to his pregnant half-sister just hours earlier in our own home. "Thank you," I murmured back. "I have some special surprises planned for tonight's program." Carlton's smile faltered slightly. "Surprises? Nothing dramatic, just some additional announcements I thought would be appropriate for such a milestone year." This wasn't entirely a lie. I did have announcements planned. They just weren't the kind Carlton was expecting. The dinner proceeded flawlessly through multiple courses, accompanied by the usual speeches about literacy programs and community impact. I played my role perfectly, the devoted foundation president graciously accepting praise for another successful event. But I was watching the clock, waiting for the moment when everything would change. At exactly 9:30, as dessert was being served, I rose from my seat and moved to the podium. The room gradually quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward me expectantly. "Good evening, everyone. Before we conclude tonight's festivities, I have several important announcements to share." Carlton looked puzzled but not alarmed. Across the room, Bryn had paused in her coordination duties to watch my speech. "First, I'm delighted to report that this year's gala has raised $2.8 million for children's literacy programs." Enthusiastic applause filled the ballroom. I waited for it to subside before continuing. "However, recent financial audits have revealed some irregularities in our foundation's accounts that require immediate attention. Effective immediately, all financial transactions will be suspended pending a comprehensive investigation by federal authorities." The applause died abruptly. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carlton's face had gone pale, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "I want to assure everyone that these irregularities appear to be the result of unauthorized access to foundation accounts by individuals with administrative privileges. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division will be conducting a full investigation beginning tomorrow morning." This was the first part of my trap. The Whitmore Foundation's finances were indeed being investigated because I had requested the audit myself after discovering that Carlton had been using foundation accounts to facilitate some of his offshore transfers. The federal investigation was real, and it would lead directly to his other criminal activities. "Additionally," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "I want to address some personal matters that affect the Foundation's future leadership." Carlton started to rise from his seat, but Victoria's hand on his arm stopped him. She was watching me with fascination, as if finally understanding that something momentous was happening. After 25 years of marriage, my husband Carlton and I have decided to separate. This decision became necessary when I discovered systematic financial fraud involving our joint assets, including the theft of over $800,000 through unauthorized offshore accounts. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Carlton's face had gone from pale to ashen, and I could see Bryn near the service entrance, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. I want to emphasize that these alleged crimes are Carlton's personal responsibility and do not reflect the values or mission of our foundation. However, given his administrative role in our organization, immediate changes to our leadership structure are necessary to protect the integrity of our charitable mission. The room was completely silent now. 800 of Boston's most influential citizens hanging on every word. This was exactly the audience I had wanted. People whose opinion Carlton valued, whose social approval had always mattered to him more than simple human decency. Furthermore, I said, my voice growing stronger with each revelation, I recently learned that the individual responsible for facilitating these financial crimes is someone we trusted completely. Our longtime household manager, Bryn Morrison. What makes this betrayal particularly shocking is that Ms. Morrison is carrying my husband's child, conceived during their 2-year affair. The collective intake of breath was audible. Several women at nearby tables reached for their wine glasses, needing something to steady themselves. Carlton had half risen from his chair again, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. But perhaps most disturbing of all, I continued, knowing this final revelation would destroy any remaining sympathy for their situation. Recent DNA testing has confirmed that Ms. Morrison is Carlton's half-sister, the illegitimate daughter of his deceased father, Charles Whitmore. This time the gasps turned to sounds of genuine horror. Incest was shocking enough, but incest combined with theft and betrayal created a level of scandal that would destroy Carlton's reputation permanently. I share these painful personal details only because they directly impact our foundation's credibility and future operations. When people entrusted with charitable funds abuse that trust for personal gain, the entire philanthropic community suffers. I paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some showed sympathy, others disgust, but most displayed the kind of fascination people feel when witnessing a spectacular downfall. Effective immediately, Carlton Whitmore has been removed from all positions with the Whitmore Foundation. A new board of directors, composed entirely of independent community leaders, will assume control of our operations while federal investigators complete their work. Carlton finally found his voice. Roberta, you can't. I can, and I have, I said calmly. The paperwork was filed this afternoon. Federal marshals are currently executing search warrants at our home and at your office, securing evidence for the criminal investigation. This was true. While Carlton and Bryn thought they were preparing for another evening of secret glances and stolen moments, federal agents were photographing every document in Carlton's study and downloading every file from his computer. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, I apologize for ending this beautiful evening on such a difficult note. However, I believe transparency and accountability are essential values, especially in charitable work. The Whitmore Foundation will continue its mission under new leadership, stronger than ever. I stepped back from the podium to scattered, uncertain applause. Some people seemed unsure whether they had witnessed a courageous act of whistleblowing or a spectacular act of public revenge. I didn't particularly care which interpretation they preferred. Carlton was on his feet now, moving toward me with desperate urgency, but hotel security personnel whom I had briefed earlier intercepted him before he could reach the head table. Mrs. Whitmore, one of the officers said quietly, we have instructions to escort Mr. Whitmore from the premises. Federal agents are waiting to speak with him in the lobby. As Carlton was led away, his face a mask of shock and humiliation, I caught sight of Bryn near the service entrance. She was backing toward the exit, her face pale with terror, one hand protectively covering her stomach. But she wouldn't escape that easily. Federal agents were waiting for her as well, with questions about her role in facilitating Carlton's financial crimes and her use of fraudulent identification to gain employment in our household. Victoria approached the podium, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. Are you all right? She asked quietly. I'm better than I've been in years, I replied honestly. For the first time in decades, I know exactly where I stand. What will you do now? I looked around the ballroom, at the faces of people I had known for decades, people who would spend the next several months dissecting every detail of Carlton's downfall. Some would whisper that I had been too harsh, too public in my revenge. Others would praise my courage in exposing corruption and protecting charitable funds. I'm going to rebuild, I said simply. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to create a life based on truth rather than appearances. It's going to be considerably smaller than what I had before, but it will be entirely mine. As federal agents led Carlton and Bryn away in handcuffs, a sight that would dominate Boston social media for weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 25 years. Complete and total freedom. The trap had worked perfectly. Carlton would face federal charges for fraud, money laundering, and theft. Bryn would be charged as an accomplice and would likely serve time in federal prison, where giving birth to her half-brother's child would be the least of her problems. And I would be free to discover who I really was when I wasn't busy being the perfect wife to a man who had never deserved my devotion. It was, I realized, the best anniversary gift I had ever given myself. 6 months after the night that changed everything, I stood in the kitchen of my new home in Cambridge, watching the morning light filter through gauze curtains as I prepared coffee in a simple French press. The ritual was slower than the elaborate espresso machine I had operated for 25 years in Beacon Hill, but there was something deeply satisfying about the deliberate pace, the attention required for each step. My new life was full of such small revelations. The house itself was a Victorian cottage I had purchased with my own money that had been rightfully mine all along, once federal investigators finished unraveling Carlton's financial deceptions. It was perhaps 1/10 the size of our former mansion, but every square foot belonged entirely to me. No shared mortgages, no joint accounts, no hidden liens or secret obligations. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed once federal authorities became involved. Carlton's offshore accounts had been frozen within days, and his systematic fraud had been so well documented that plea negotiations began almost immediately. His lawyers had advised cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing, which meant I learned details about his deceptions that I might never have discovered otherwise. The depth of his betrayal had been staggering. For more than 3 years, he had been systematically draining not just our joint accounts, but also the Whitmore Foundation's emergency reserves, using the stolen funds to purchase properties that he registered under false names. The total amount approached $1.6 million by the time investigators finished their calculations. But perhaps more painful than the financial theft was the revelation of how long I had been living a lie. Carlton's affair with Bryn hadn't lasted 2 years, as she had initially claimed. It had begun almost immediately after she joined our household 10 years ago, when she was 19 and he was 57. What I had interpreted as fatherly mentorship had actually been grooming, and what I had seen as household efficiency had been the systematic invasion of my privacy and dignity. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my morning reflection. Margaret Chen, checking on my adjustment to civilian life, as she jokingly called my existence outside the federal investigation. Margaret. Coffee later. I have updates on the sentencing. Me. My place at 2? I'll make lunch. Cooking had become one of my unexpected pleasures in this new life. For 25 years, elaborate meals had been Bryn's responsibility or the caterer's art. Now I was discovering the meditative quality of chopping vegetables, the satisfaction of creating something nourishing with my own hands. At exactly 2 o'clock, Margaret knocked on my front door. She looked more relaxed than I had seen her during the intense months of legal proceedings, wearing jeans and a casual sweater instead of her usual courtroom armor. "This place is perfect," she said, settling into one of the comfortable armchairs I had chosen for my small living room. "How are you adjusting?" "Better than I expected." I poured tea from a ceramic pot, another small ritual that marked my new life. Some days I wake up and can't believe how quiet it is. No staff, no social obligations, no one needing anything from me except what I choose to give. And Carlton's sentencing? The question I had been both anticipating and dreading. What did the judge decide? Margaret's expression grew serious. 7 years for Carlton, 3 for Bryn. They'll serve their time in separate federal facilities, and Carlton will be required to make full financial restitution to both you and the foundation. 7 years. Carlton would be 74 when he was released, his business reputation destroyed, his social standing obliterated. Bryn would serve her time in a women's federal prison, giving birth to her child under circumstances I couldn't allow myself to contemplate too deeply. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret asked gently. I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I might have felt triumphant about their punishment, vindicated by the justice system's recognition of the crimes committed against me. Now I felt something more complex. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of closure that allowed me to stop defining my life in relation to their betrayal. "I feel free," I said finally. "Free to stop thinking about them, stop planning around them, stop defining myself as either their victim or their victor." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's healthy. What about Victoria? Have you stayed in touch?" Victoria Whitmore had surprised me throughout the legal proceedings. Rather than defending her brother or maintaining family loyalty, she had publicly supported my decision to expose his crimes. She had even testified as a character witness during my testimony, describing the years of financial abuse I had endured without fully understanding what was happening. "We have dinner once a month," I said. "She's dealing with her own shame about not recognizing Carlton's character earlier, but we found an unexpected friendship in our shared experience of having been deceived by someone we trusted." It was strange, building a relationship with my former sister-in-law based on our mutual recognition that the man we had both loved was fundamentally different from who we thought he was. But Victoria's support had been invaluable during the hardest months, and her friendship was one of the unexpected gifts of my new life. "Any other relationships developing?" Margaret asked with a knowing smile. I felt myself blush slightly, which was ridiculous at 64 but somehow inevitable when discussing Henry Morrison, no relation to Bryn despite the shared surname. Henry was a retired literature professor I had met at the Cambridge Public Library, where I had started volunteering with their adult literacy program. He was 70, recently widowed after 40 years of marriage, and possessed the kind of gentle humor that made even difficult conversations feel manageable. "We're taking things very slowly," I admitted. "Neither of us is interested in rushing into anything serious, but he's kind, genuinely kind, in a way I'd forgotten was possible." "That's wonderful. You deserve kindness." After Margaret left, I found myself walking through my small house, taking inventory of the life I was building piece by piece. The living room contained books I had actually chosen rather than volumes selected for their impressive spines. The bedroom featured a comfortable reading chair positioned beside a window, where morning light made reading a pleasure rather than a duty. Most importantly, the house contained no photographs of my previous life. I had packed away the albums documenting 25 years of marriage, not out of bitterness, but because those images belonged to a woman who no longer existed. The Roberta who had posed beside Carlton at charity events, who had smiled graciously while being systematically robbed and betrayed, who had measured her worth by her ability to maintain appearances. That woman had died the morning I woke up with patches of missing hair. The woman who had replaced her was still discovering her own preferences, her own priorities, her own capacity for joy and simple pleasures. My hair had grown back, healthier than before, and now cut in a shorter, more practical style that required no elaborate maintenance. I had kept one of the expensive wigs from my recovery period, not the one I had worn to Carlton's sentencing, but a simpler piece that I sometimes used when I wanted to feel more formally presented. Most days, though, I preferred my natural hair, gray-streaked and unpretentious. The doorbell rang again, interrupting my reflection. Through the window, I saw Henry on my front porch, holding a small bouquet of daffodils and wearing the slightly nervous expression he always displayed when making unplanned visits. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said when I opened the door. "I was walking past and thought you might enjoy these. The first of the season." This was typical of Henry. Small gestures offered without expectation, attention to details like seasonal flowers and personal preferences. He had learned that I loved daffodils during one of our library conversations, and he remembered such things without making them feel like obligations. "They're beautiful," I said, accepting the flowers and inviting him inside. "Would you like some tea?" As Henry settled into the kitchen chair that was becoming his usual spot during these visits, I realized something that would have shocked the woman I used to be. I was happy. Not the desperate, anxious happiness of someone afraid to lose what they had, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of someone who had built exactly the life they wanted. "How was your day?" Henry asked, a question he always posed with genuine interest rather than social obligation. "Productive," I said, arranging the daffodils in a simple glass vase. Margaret brought news about the sentencing, and I finished organizing the donation of books for the literacy program. Henry nodded approvingly. He understood the importance of the literacy work to my healing process. The way teaching adults to read had restored my sense of purpose after the foundation work became impossible. There was something profoundly healing about helping people discover their own voices through written words, especially after spending so many years having my own voice silenced by people who claimed to love me. 7 years for Carlton, 3 for Bryn, I said, sharing the news I knew Henry had been waiting to hear. He reached across the small kitchen table and covered my hand with his. "How do you feel about that?" It was the same question Margaret had asked, but somehow it felt different coming from Henry. Less professional curiosity, more personal concern for my emotional well-being. "Relieved," I said honestly. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because it's finally completely over. I don't have to think about them anymore unless I choose to. "And do you choose to?" I looked around my small kitchen, at the daffodils brightening the space, at the man who had entered my life without drama or deception, asking for nothing more than my company, and offering nothing less than complete honesty in return. "Less and less," I admitted. "There are whole days now when I don't think about Carlton or Bryn at all. I'm too busy discovering who I am when I'm not trying to be the perfect wife to someone who never deserved my perfection." Henry smiled, the kind of genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "And what have you discovered?" It was a larger question than he probably realized. What had I discovered about myself in these months of radical solitude and gradual rebuilding? I discovered that I'm stronger than I thought, but also that I don't need to be strong all the time. I discovered that I actually enjoy cooking, reading, gardening. Simple pleasures I never had time for when my life was scheduled around other people's needs. I paused, considering whether to share the deeper revelation that had emerged during my conversations with the therapist Margaret had recommended. "I also discovered that I was complicit in my own diminishment," I said finally. "Not responsible for Carlton's crimes, but responsible for accepting a marriage where I was valued more for what I provided than for who I was." Henry squeezed my hand gently. "That's a difficult recognition, but necessary. Because understanding my own patterns is the only way to ensure I never repeat them." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, drinking tea and watching the afternoon light shift across my small garden. This was another revelation. That silence with the right person could be more intimate than conversation with the wrong one. "I should let you get back to your evening," Henry said eventually, though he made no immediate move to leave. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the spontaneity, "would you like to stay for dinner? I was planning to try a new recipe, and it's always better to have someone to share it with." His face lit up with pleasure. "I'd love that." As we worked together in my small kitchen, Henry chopping vegetables while I seasoned the chicken, I reflected on how different this domesticity felt from the elaborate dinner parties I had orchestrated for 25 years. This was collaboration rather than performance, genuine pleasure rather than social obligation. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said as we sat down to eat. "Of course." "Do you ever regret exposing Carlton so publicly? Some people might have handled it more privately." I considered this question, which I had asked myself many times during the past 6 months. "I regret that it was necessary," I said slowly. "I regret that Carlton chose to betray not just me, but also the charitable organizations that trusted him. But I don't regret my response. Privacy would have protected his reputation at the expense of justice for his victims. Including yourself. Including myself. For 25 years, I protected Carlton's reputation by staying silent about problems in our marriage. That silence enabled him to commit increasingly serious crimes against people who trusted him. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Henry nodded thoughtfully. It must have taken tremendous courage. Actually, by the time I stood up at that podium, it felt less like courage and more like inevitability. I had spent so many years being afraid of disappointing people, afraid of making scenes, afraid of not being perfect. Once I stopped being afraid, the choice became clear. After dinner, we moved to my small living room, where Henry built a fire in the fireplace, while I selected music from the collection of recordings I had been building. Jazz and classical pieces I had always loved, but never felt free to play when Carlton was home. "This is nice," Henry said, settling beside me on the couch with the comfortable distance of two people who were still learning each other's boundaries. "It is," I agreed. "Simple and honest and completely mine." As the fire crackled and soft piano music filled the room, I felt something I had never experienced during my marriage. Complete contentment with exactly where I was and who I was with. No anxiety about the future, no regrets about the past, just the peaceful satisfaction of a life lived according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. When Henry left that evening, he kissed my cheek gently and said, "Thank you for a lovely evening, Roberta. I hope we can do this again soon." I'd like that very much. After he left, I sat by the dying fire, thinking about the long journey from the woman who had awakened 6 months ago to discover her life was built on lies, to the woman I was becoming. The process hadn't been easy. There had been nights of rage, days of grief, weeks of uncertainty about what came next. But as I prepared for bed in my small, honest house, I realized that every moment of difficulty had been worth it for this. The knowledge that I was finally living a life that was entirely my own. Carlton and Bryn had tried to destroy me with chemicals and cruelty, believing that a 64-year-old woman would crumble under the weight of their betrayal. Instead, they had freed me from a prison I hadn't even realized I was living in. The woman who had spent 25 years being the perfect wife was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more content with the beautifully imperfect life she was building, one honest day at a time. And that, I realized as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my peaceful bedroom, was the greatest revenge of all. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.